Hey students, Mr. Jones here. One of your extra credit projects that I'm putting out for you to do is a tree search. So we're learning about forest fires and forest ecology, and what a great way to learn about all the different diverse trees that we have here in eastern Washington and North Idaho. So I'm going to encourage you to get out on the trails. I'm actually climbing around here in Liberty Lake Park up in Micah Peak, searching for all the trees that I want you to find so I can show you some examples, and just enjoying the great outdoors and these times that you get stuck indoors. So I hope you can get around and look for the list of trees that I'm about to present to you. It's a great way to just explore, learn about our ecosystem, and enjoy the nature that surrounds us. The most common tree you're going to find around here in Spokane and throughout a lot of the United States, this tree is a huge rain, is that Ponderosa Pine. It goes all the way from Mexico up to into Canada. It's a dry pine, so it can survive a lot of different climates as far as where it lives, but it's really common around here, and you probably, some of you have it in your backyard. So the common sign of a Ponderosa, if you look at the bark here, it's got a little redder bark with these huge furrows as the older it gets, big pieces of bark, and it actually has the longest needle of any pine. So you can find Ponderosa pines with needles that are easily, 7 inches, 9 inches long. So I'm going to walk over here to another one where you can see the needles that are a little lower to the ground. We have these really long needles, and a lot of times they'll be in clumps of 3, sometimes in clumps of 2, depending on where you are in the country, but easy to find around here. And they have these huge long needles on them. And if you look down at the pine cones of the Ponderosa pine, they are a lot of times really prickly and sharp. And here's one right here for you. So if you look at the pine cone needles, they'll have a very distinctive little point on their cone right there. A medium-sized cone, but they are really common in this area, so it's probably going to be the easiest tree for you to find in our forests. There's another one right here with easier to see those little points on their cones. That's a really common Ponderosa pine cone. Okay, so our next tree right here, this is a Douglas fir. This is a really young Douglas fir, and they're probably the second most common pine here in this area of the Northwest. And so they get really, really big, have a really long life, but they're different than the Ponderosas and some of the other pines. And one of the ways you can tell is their needles, they're a relatively short needle, and they go all the way around the stem of the tree. So if we pan over here as I walk, there's some bigger, older Douglas, and you can see right here as they mature, I walk up there, there's one right here, there's one right here. And again, the needles, as we kind of pull this branch down, the shorter, they're pretty soft. They're not super pokey and hard on your fingers, but they go all the way around. And then if you look at the bark here, it's a really rough, grayish bark. Kind of looks, scaly and old. And as they get bigger, the bark gets even rougher and the furrows get even deeper. One of my favorite things about the Douglas fir, though, is the pine cones, because if I walk up to you with these little pine cones, they're pretty small pine cones, but on the pine cones, if we can get this on the camera, they have little mouse tails coming out of each of their little scales on these pine cones. And so it's a really good identifier of, if you're looking at a tree and look around underneath these Douglas, they drop a bunch of these and they all have these little mouse tails. So that's my favorite part of identification on these Douglas. So this is a great example of an old growth Douglas. This tree's got to be several hundred years old. You can see how massive the trunk is. I can't even halfway hug it. But the bark, really rough bark, deep furrows. And again, the old pine cones all around it with the little mouse tails on them. But this is a big tree, and this has been here a long time on this trail. So one of the trees on our tree identification is the quaking aspen. So this is an example of a young quaking aspen. And as it grows up, one of the identifiers you're going to see on this trees are this really smooth white bark it's got a lot of these little scars and things on them, pretty typical of a tree. But this is a deciduous tree, so it's not a pine tree. And so one of the tales of this tree will soon be turning yellow, the leaves, all of it. And the leaves on them they're broad, they're flat, they are pointed in nature. And so they're called the quaking aspen because you get a whole grove of them, which I'm standing in a grove right here. We'll pan around in a minute and look at it. They have this really cool sound to them. But what's cool about these trees is this tree and this tree are probably genetically the same tree because they propagate or make new trees by shooting out roots, and they shoot out new trees popping up, and then they make a whole grove of trees. So it's possible this aspen grove we're standing in is all the same tree, just with a bunch of new trees popping up. Some of your parents might complain about their quaking aspens in their yard because they'll shoot out into your lawn. So let me pull up real quick with you. You can see a leaf of a quaking aspen, so you'll see broad leaf, and this will soon turn yellow. But if you kind of zoom around out over here, you can see this whole grove of aspens, and you'll see a giant pine trunk right there. But these all could be the same tree, and in a couple more weeks these will all be turned yellow and they'll be losing their leaves because they're deciduous. So right here is a great example of a bark of the birch tree. Now there's a lot of lichen on this one, but it's a very smooth bark, similar to an aspen. But again, the difference you will see on these guys is you don't see as much scarring and pitting, but the bark will peel away in these papery rolls. Let me see if I can get one on here. Right here's a great example. So this won't happen on an aspen. You can see how you can peel that bark. I don't want to peel too much on that tree, but sometimes they're called paper bark birches. Really pretty trees you'll see here, and the leaves are starting to change on the mountains because it's fall. So the birch canopy looks really similar to aspen trees, but the shape of the leaves is different. One of the main differences, and then obviously the bark of the tree, as I come over here to this tree and get out of the sun a little bit, you'll see the bark is really smooth, but it will peel off in these papery layers. So there's some papery layer of a birch tree. And if you look down here on the forest floor, we have some old trees, and the bark is peels right off. And Native Americans used to use this for a lot of different things. So you might even hear it termed as paper bark birch. But the leaves are different shape than aspen. So here's a leaf shape. I found one on the ground here. They're not smooth around the edges, very jagged leaves that fall off. Now this one's yellow because it's fall, pretty beautiful, but that is a birch tree. So we're sitting here in a nice, beautiful birch grove. So another fairly common tree in the Northwest in the mountains is called the ash tree, and some of you might have ash trees in your yard because they grow really well here. But it's a deciduous tree, and so you have these leaves that look like this with all these little branching off like that on them. And so one of the really telltale signs of an ash tree, and you'll probably recognize this as I pan up, is they have these berries at this time of year. They're either a bright red or kind of an orangish color, and this one happens to be a bright red. So it's called a green mountain ash tree, but they are native to this area. They grow up all the way up into British Columbia, deciduous. So these leaves are going to turn here to a nice reddish color here pretty soon in the fall. But the way you tell is you look for those berries. You look for it's a smooth bark tree, but these leaves are really the telltale sign. If you have them like this, there's actually one outside in the courtyard at our school. So take a look for this type of tree. So another common tree that we have, and it's really cool that we live here because it is unique to the Northwest. It grows in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia, and nowhere else in the world, is what some locals will call the tamarack, but it's actually the western larch. And this is a cool tree because it's a deciduous pine. So in a few weeks, all these needles will be turning yellow, and it will shed its needles. So it's a bright yellow, and they're all over the place around here. Into North Idaho and actually into Montana too. But one of the cool things about it, how you tell these trees, is if you look at the branches, they're just really fuzzy and straggly. And so if we can zoom in on them, they call them pincushion needles. So right here, if you look at this, there's like a cushion right here, and all these needles radiate out from this little pincushion area. So everywhere you find the needles, there's not a needle count you're looking for. It's just this radiation of needles coming out all over this branch. So there's one there, there's one there, there's one there. And so it's a very signature of this tree is these pincushion needles, and they're very fuzzy branches all the way out. So when you see them as an adult tree, which we'll look at here in a second, they look kind of scraggly, but they're really beautiful in the fall when they change their needle colors. All right, so behind me up here, you have an example of a western large tree. That's that deciduous pine. And you can kind of see how scraggly and rough and all the branches are covered in those needles. And like I said, they'll be losing those needles here in a few weeks. They'll be turning a bright yellow. And their pine cones, if you notice that they were all over the tree, they're a relatively small pine cone. And so you can kind of see here, they're not a big pine cone, but then the branches, when they lose all the needles, they're really rough and bumpy, like they have a bunch of little warts all over them. But that's the pin cushions where all those pine needles were coming out before it lost them all. So really common tree, and in a couple weeks if I were to come back up here, that would be a bright yellow, really pretty. So another common tree we have here in the Northwest, and you have to go up a little bit into the woods and a little bit more of shaded areas, a little more elevation, they need a little more water, is the grand fir. And so the signs of a grand fir, this is a little one, are these nice flat needles. So you see they're very flat, and on the bottom they have this silver color to them. Really common trees that we buy for Christmas trees if you go search for a Christmas tree. Another way to determine if you're not sure if it's a grand fir is you can pull off the needles, and you can take and crush them in your palm and rub them in your palm. When you smell them, they smell like citrus, kind of like a mandarin orange. So that's another really cool thing about the grand fir. When they grow up, you have one right here behind me, they have a lot of dead underbranches, and you can see the bark on those is a little more smooth, not as scaly as the other trees around here, but you still have these flat needles. And I don't know if I can see any of the pine cones, but generally speaking, they're little smaller pine cones that you will find, and I don't see any around me on the floor here, but the easiest way to identify them is for sure these flat needles, and then if you're wondering, like I said, take them off, give them a smell. They smell really nice. So here's some examples of the pine cone from the grand fir. So you can see they're really tight little scales. They're a little smaller pine cones, so not as big as a Douglas fir or a Ponderosa pine, which is quite a bit larger as far as the pine cones go. So here's an example of a older grand fir. This one's got to be several hundred years old, so they get really big, but they have this nice Christmas tree shape all the way through. And then there's kind of cluttered here. If I zoom into the bark, you can see on that fir, it's a really very smooth bark, but the underside of those needles, as I zoom up the grand fir there, it's got this silvery color, so very much a Christmas tree shape, a very pretty tree. So another tree a little more common here in the Northwest is the lodgepole pine. You won't find a whole lot of them down in the valley floor around the Spokane area, but as you go up in the upper elevations around Mount Spokane and in the upper hills around town, you might come across these trees. So a couple of things that you can look for in the lodgepole pine, because it's a little bit different to identify. On their needles, they're in groups of 2, so I just picked some needles off right here, and you can see they come in clumps of 2. A lot of little cones. If you look right here on the branches, you see these little cones right here. Little oblong cones, but needles in groups of 2 on that branch. Oblong cone. Needles are a medium in length. But the trunk, if I come over here, if we look at the trunk of the tree, you can see it kind of, I guess people describe it as kind of cornflaky. So if you look at the rough bark on this tree right here, it's not near as rough as, say, you have in a Douglas fir and things, but it's got these little cornflake clumps that come off of it, you know, the cereal cornflakes. So that's the way I've heard a lot of people describe it with these this bark of the tree. A very slender tree that grows nice and tall, which hence the term lodgepole pine. It's used for poles a lot and historically. So it is another common tree that you might keep an eye out for. It's a little tougher to find, but if you keep your eyes open, you will find it. Okay, the last tree on my list is probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite trees, and it's the Western Red Cedar. A really, really cool tree. One of the reasons it's my favorite is they can live thousands of years, become really, really large, and grow to be just these majestic trees that are huge. We don't have a whole lot around here for a few reasons. One, they need to be in a very, very wet area. They grow around creeks and on these draws that come down the mountains that have springs and have the snow melt coming down. So I had to travel up here to Liberty Lake Park and take a hike. There is a cedar grove back that you can get to pretty easily. It's really a cool place if you take a hike straight back from the parking lot at the Liberty Lake Regional Park. I'm up kind of around the Boy Scout cabin. I went mountain biking to get to one of my favorite spots. And so a couple things about these trees. They're not needled. So if you look at them, the needles here, they're flat and they kind of look like scales. So a little unique that way, so very easy to identify. This is a pretty young tree. And so I got close to it because a lot of the older trees in these groves, they grow really tall and it's hard to get to their needles. And if you get underneath them, one of their characteristics is the groves are really dark underneath and very acidic soil. So great camping spots because they don't have any undergrowth and really soft from all of the needles that have fallen to the ground over, could be thousands of years. So let me zoom over here to one of these trees and I'll show you what the bark looks like so you can see one of the other identifying characteristics of these trees. So behind me is a tree that is a cedar, and the bark, it's getting kind of dark under here because the sun's going down here in the evening, but the other thing is it would be dark here in the middle of the day. So if you're looking for a nice cool spot in the summertime, cedar groves are great. If I zoom into the bark, one of the things that's characteristics of the bark here is this really long and stringy bark. So if you peel it up or down, you kind of see the bark comes down in these long strips. Don't want to do too much to damage the tree, but that's a very easy way to identify them besides their needles being scale-like. This tree, although I can't even get the whole thing in my camera, is actually, there it is fairly young, believe it or not, maybe a few hundred years old. Remember, I said they could live thousands. So you will find that you can even find groves maybe in state parks and national areas, national forests that have been preserved from these trees that have these massive cedar stumps. One great place to go look for remnants of cedar stumps is outside of Avery in the St. Joe River. There's huge cedar stumps that burned in the 1910 fire. Really, really interesting because cedar doesn't rot, or very easily rot. They just will be there for hundreds and hundreds of years as stumps that are just these gnarls that stick up with a lot of fire damage on them. So hope you can find all these trees. It's been really fun out searching for them, but it's going to be a little bit of work, and I hope you take some time to just hike around the valley, get into Idaho. There's a lot of places to look for trees. Liberty Lake Park is a great one to have a search for them because you will find them all in that park. And up in Mount Spokane, another great place. You'll find all the trees there. So good luck. Look forward to seeing what you can find. Hey, Roo, say hi to the kids, Roo. Say hello. Rooney, say hi.